As innovators and technologists, can we grow our effectiveness with more vulnerability? And will slowing down the creative process also help? Here to talk about this and more is Charlie O'Donnell. Charlie is the founder and general partner of Brooklyn Bridge Ventures. Aside, he's not making new investments right now, and an investor coach for venture professionals. He publishes a weekly newsletter called Next NYC. It's awesome, with the purpose of connecting the NYC and greater innovation community, and publishes also thoughtful writing at thisisgoingtobebig.com, which I will bring up in this episode. So I can't wait for this conversation. But first, welcome to this week's episode of Make Sense, a video podcast that simplifies complex issues at the intersection of tech and people. There are many. So whether you're totally hyped on AI and you're ready for the robot takeover, or you want to crawl into a cave after deleting all of your social media accounts, I'm here with my guests to help make sense of what's going on so you can design yourself into the future. My name is Lindsay Tabus, the Lady Engineer. I am a pragmatic futurist and human-first technologist, serial entrepreneur, and innovation consultant. If you're new here, subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Let's make sense of how we can step up as creatives to solve the biggest problems we face. Charlie, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I am so thrilled to be talking to you. It's been a few months in the making. So let's start with our first segment, Crystal Ball. What does the future hold? This is where I call out interesting predictions for this year, and my guests tell us their hot take. I'm going to fire off some predictions, and Charlie, if you know something about them, which I think you do, you'll say, yes, I want that to happen, or no, please no. And maybe if there's some added color that comes to mind, you throw it in there. If you don't know, you can still say, no, I don't want that to happen or something.
Lightning round. I'm excited.
Okay. I made this one just for you. Twitter will become the next everything app that is video first and enables intimate community-based conversations and panels.
Yeah, nothing. It's The Walking Dead. I'm very skeptical that anything will come of it. I think
Yeah.
Elon should probably worry much more about Tesla.
Yeah. So, Charlie, you wrote a post late last year titled, It's Time to Leave Twitter, and you posted again calling for VCs to leave. Why is this important enough for you to call out?
I do think that social media in general has a lot of problems, right? And so I'm not necessarily thrilled about Meta as a company or some of the others, but Twitter/X is a unique case in that it is owned by one singular person, and a person that I don't feel the need to enrich in any way or support any of their endeavors. It's one thing to specifically take away all of the safety and protections and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, the site quality has just sort of fallen off the table. It's another to support anti-Semitism and hate and all of that sort of stuff, specifically with his language. And it's a real problem. It's not something that I feel comfortable being associated myself. But also as a VC, people follow us. And so if you're a VC, you're kind of telling entrepreneurs that if you want to get funded, if you want to learn about who I am, here's where to do it. And so you're forcing this platform on founders. And that's not something I'm comfortable with. I'd rather be over at LinkedIn, which I guess is Microsoft, which is a weird thing to say that I prefer. But here we are.
Yeah, I've always appreciated your thoughtfulness and my use of Twitter. I refuse to call it X. I've been on this platform since April 2007. I was able to secure Lindsay T because I was that early. Like I moved away from it because my attention span didn't work. I was also working with a lot of non-technical founders, and they're not on Twitter as much as our peers, professional peers are. And for sure, I have some gripes with Musk, and I agree with you not wanting to enrich him in any way. So, next one, your article May last year on this is going to be big. Why AI won't be the investment opportunity everyone thinks it is. Fast forward, it's February prediction. Many generative AI companies will die. After a huge hype year in 2023, the next stage of the hype cycle is this is Gartner's trough of disillusionment. Competition, platform risk, and low returns from enterprise customers will dry out funding into this sector.
I agree with that generally. First of all, it's a really interesting and useful tool for many things. That does not necessarily mean that a new startup business will be the company that profits the most from that tool. And sort of, in some way, if you think about back in the day, there were a lot of apps out there that were, this but mobile, or you look at browsers or what have you. And I think what happens is people get excited about a new platform. And then, sometimes a startup emerges, but sometimes it's actually the incumbents who, yeah, sure, maybe are a little slow to something, but they have a lot of resources, that they have an existing user base. And in AI's case, they have a massive data and information advantage, right?
Mhm.
Uh, Whether it's Google or, you know, Microsoft or Meta, or at some point Apple, I guess. I don't know when they're going to get their act together with this.
They're talking about it, but
Yeah. It's just very surprising how slow they are about this. Although, interestingly, Apple's just not great at building software, right? Apple's a phenomenal operating system, phenomenal hardware maker, but like mail,
Mhm.
calendar, all of that sort of stuff,
Right.
Siri, it all kind of sucks.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. I don't know why Siri is so bad as it is. It'd be an interesting article to read, but yeah, there's definitely going to be some successful startups, but the speed to which VCs flocked to overfunding some of these companies because they were shiny bells and whistles, I think is, I think we got over our skis collectively, and now I think folks are kind of feeling that.
Yeah, I spent a lot of last year on this podcast explaining and talking to my guests about how there's this media hype cycle, there's this fear of missing out. And just because a technology exists doesn't mean the masses adopt it, doesn't
Hmm.
mean it becomes a viable business. And it's all, we tout all these possibilities, but then there's this long kind of what Gartner calls trough of disillusionment. I just like the reality of a user adoption curve actually sets in. So AI taking your jobs probably isn't going to happen tomorrow, but there's things you can do to like prepare yourself and future proof yourself. Uh,
Sure.
all right. So this one is specific to venture capital. VCs will turn inward to build for the future. The past year's difficult investment environment spurred a wave of retirement announcements. The fallout faced by leaderless firms will motivate more VC firms to invest time and resources into areas this asset class has historically neglected, such as internal ops, succession planning, and overall firm governance.
I have a pretty unique insight into that now that I am coaching VCs. And so, the one thing I'll say to any founder out there who is worried about the current state of their company and getting feedback from board members at VC firms, take some comfort in the fact that the VC firm is probably run worse than your company is. And I see that from my coaching clients. I think part of it is the fact that these aren't quite companies, but they have employees. And so, and there's weird conflicts internally. Your boss, who is the general partner of the firm, really wants you as the principal to find that great deal, but they want to find that great deal too. They'd be happy for you to be on the Midas list, but they kind of still want to be on the Midas list too. Your principal, who's also in your office, the both of you are kind of competing for the one partnership role that might open up in the next 10 years. There's all sorts of wacky things inside of these firms, and when you go through a difficult environment that comes right after an environment where there were some pretty good distributions and IPOs and what have you, you get a lot of senior folks saying, okay, am I up for this again? Am I
Mhm.
up for another ride? Like, if I agree to be part of this new firm, it's going to be another 7, 8, 9, 10 years before I see the kind of returns that I experienced in 2020, 2021. Um, and if you're, of a certain age or a certain level of success in life, you might not be up for that. So I think there's going to be a lot of disruption, a lot of people shifting around, new firm creation. Will VCs get better at talent development and promotion and all of that sort of stuff because of it? They haven't in the past.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a generational shift related to it, but I'm probably a little skeptical that they'll learn those lessons.
I'm pretty skeptical as well, just because the nature of VCs and the type of people it attracts, the very outward focused, aggressive, competitive, wanting to, find the best deals, looking at what everyone else is doing, fear of missing out, etc. It's like, I don't know that a year like last year will actually make them do the type of introspection this prediction kind of calls for or assumes. They're probably more either desperate, anxious, whatever, looking forward, optimistic to just like getting back out there and seeing more startups.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll give a shout out to the two firms besides my own that I have worked for, Union Square Ventures and First Round Capital, that have been successful for quite a long time. And I think collaboration and reinvention is part of both of their DNA.
Hmm.
You see USV redoes its thesis every few years. They're a very egalitarian firm, and that they've spoken about how new partners become equal partners very quickly, despite the some of the more visible folks. They have a very egalitarian sort of economic sharing among the partners, which promotes long-term stability. And I think the same with at First Round Capital, that is, I know from the inside, is always asking the question of how can we better serve
Hmm.
founders? What team members do we need? I mean, there must be 35 employees at First Round Capital now. I mean, it's a company, right?
Hmm.
And all in service to founders and always looking to figure out what's the next tool that they can build. So I think some firms build into their DNA a sort of innovation, promotion, reinvention, and those firms are the ones that last.
Hmm. Awesome. Thanks for that. So the last one, I'm not sure how much you know about this sector, but it is, precious to me just because we want to solve big problems. Growth funding will remain scarce for climate companies. So as climate companies, particularly those in mobility or large scale electrification, utility scale solar, battery sectors continue to scale and mature, the dearth of funding will be felt more acutely.
I think that is definitely the case, particularly on the early stage side. I think
Mhm.
there is a lot of funding, at least earmarked, for large scale projects. It sort of reminds me of the question of I asked a founder once, if you ever met Barack Obama, what would your ask of him be? And it's an interesting question because this is a person who has a certain level of influence in which you can't turn around and say, well, I actually need childcare this Wednesday afternoon. So, can you solve that problem for me? Are you free? Are you going to be
You
in
babysit my
Brooklyn?
kids.
Yeah, can you babysit my kids? You need to have a certain level of ask. And I think for a lot of the types of funding that's out there, if you needed $100 million to scale some kind of, electrification project, like that's probably almost easier to get than $2 million to lead your seed round for this.
Hmm.
And, the problem with a lot of the environment now is the kinds of folks that do early stage investing are generally like a little bit hardware averse. They're kind of averse to the kinds of projects that are like, yeah, $2 million helps us right now, but down the line we might need 100, right?
Hmm.
And that's sort of really gives a lot of VC type investors the cold feet, but that's the reality of a lot of these projects. I've
Hmm.
backed a company called It's Electric that's doing a really innovative version of curbside charging that actually plugs into building infrastructure and avoids the bureaucracy of utilities. They are getting a ton of traction from the cities that know that it'll be very expensive to have to do with their utility systems, and this is a much better way of doing it. Um, they got all sorts of later stage funding lined up, and folks that are coming to them saying, hey, when you need X, come and talk to us or whatever. And a lot of the responses like, yeah, that's great, but we actually just need small amounts of money now, and
Hmm.
that they are working hard, they have interest, but it's not been the easiest thing in the world to find investors at that stage willing to do something that involves, physical installations and hardware and all of that stuff.
Hmm. This is kind of an improv on my part, but I know that some of the bigger or well-known impact funds, they still want a 10x return like any VC. So even though they're looking for social impact, climate impact, all that stuff, the startup has to have the same amount of returns. I know that there are some other um, investment vehicles like revenue sharing and stuff like that that might make it easier for smaller companies or companies that aren't going to grow that way. Is that still a very like niche part of the VC community? Or do you hear about investors willing to use different vehicles because the returns might be lower for
I would
this?
just actually don't think the returns are necessarily lower.
Okay.
I don't necessarily think that that's the issue. I think it's a staging issue, right? That, some companies are smaller companies just because
Mhm.
they have yet to become bigger companies, but the opportunity is still there, right?
Mhm.
Like we have not even scratched the surface on the electrification of our infrastructure and what we can do for carbon recapture or any number of things. And in fact, when you start to look at the numbers and the scale of how much of our grid and the kinds of shifts that need to be made, it's huge.
Right.
It's still fairly quite large. Um, so, I think, and some of it just has to be equity funding,
Hmm.
right? And I think part of the issue is there are some instances where when you get some installations in or when you get projects up and running, debt and scalable debt is really interesting and is really useful and will definitely be part of that capital stack. But at some point, you need funding for the team to design the product and the lead generation and sales folks to go out and sell before you have secured revenue generating projects, right? And that's just always going to be equity.
Hmm.
So I think there's still a need on the equity side, and debt is helpful, but I think early stage equity is the area where there needs to be some more risk taking capital and smaller bites, especially for leads. Actually, that's one of the big problems in this area too. Is there are some funds, corporate strategics and all of that sort of stuff that would love to be a part of rounds, but they don't necessarily write up term sheets, which I also felt was a very silly thing because if you're going to put money to work and risk it, why would you just outsource decision making capabilities to other
Right.
folks?
Some of the big corporations have huge legal departments. Why not take the jump and leverage those to write the terms themselves?
Right. Or don't write the terms yourself and use off the shelf NVCA documents or Y Combinator safes or what have you. And for a 5-person startup, like, come up with the cleanest term sheet you could possibly imagine and know that your business risk is more in the this is a first time founder and hard stuff is hard, and not in paragraph B, subsection A, we wrote this legal term in this very particular way. Like, that's not where your business risk is in a 5-person startup.
Do you think that has to do with the maturity of corporate venture groups or that leadership of that corporation aren't necessarily comfortable with the risk taking that happens in the venture world? So maybe they're not fully invested in their venture arm in a way, like they're not ready to give that type of autonomy and authority to their venture arm.
Yeah, I think it's more about like perception of risk, right? If you pitch and say, "Hey, we should be making strategic investments," the answer saying, "Well, that sounds really risky." Well, what if we only invested in deals that other VCs were already leading? It's very easy for somebody to say, "Oh, yes, that sounds less risky." Well, VCs invest stupid stuff all the time, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean you're going to avoid the zeros just because some other idiot is writing a check to it. So,
Corporations invest in stupid stuff all the time. I mean, 55% of enterprise IT projects fail. So
right, right,
let's be real about what the risk is, right?
right. And if you're going to de-risk it by doing more smaller things. Right?
Hmm.
That's, instead of only doing $30 million chunks into, as of yet unproven stuff, just because, some VC that you heard of wrote a $30 million check to it side by side with you. Do $31 million checks in which you either lead or don't require a lead, and you say, "Hey, yeah, if you get $2 million of investment, we'll be half of it, and we're doing it on a safe, and we don't need a lead for this because you're 5 people and the terms seem reasonable."
So, on the note of perceived risk, I'm going to wrap up Crystal Ball and move into our second segment. Who needs a safety net? In this segment, I ask my guests to share risks, failures, nay, learning lessons of entrepreneurship, creating their own path into the future. So, Charlie, one of the reasons I enjoy reading your writing is because I think you model a healthy mix of both left and right brain thinking. That is, you strike a balance between, analytical and creative thinking.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And in our society and culture, and even more so in corporate and technology circles, vulnerability has historically been, frowned upon or made people uncomfortable. We really fear not knowing, right? And that's where the risk comes in. And we succumb to the pressure to, have the answer. And it's like very, very left brained. Is that, do you agree with that?
Yeah,
Cool.
for sure.
I'm not saying anything crazy here. So you wrote about this just, I believe, yesterday on LinkedIn, that so much startup advice is very prescriptive, suggesting there's only one way to do something. And you also shared another investor's post where you talk about the pressure of feeling like your self-worth is tied up in being good, at the thing that you're doing. So, Charlie, how can we bring more vulnerability into entrepreneurship? How do you coach this or do it yourself?
So I think acknowledging that failure is a possibility is really important. It's how I approach my fund investing. So many times you get asked to speak as a VC and you get introduced as this successful VC because that's what sells the tickets at somebody's conference or what have you, and you tie your identity up in, "Oh, I'm successful, I'm good at this," right? And I don't necessarily think that acknowledging failure is or the potential for failure is a bad thing, right? This might not work is healthy. Now, I think once you acknowledge it, you bust your butt to try and make sure that you do everything to avoid it, right? You don't want to fail.
Mhm.
And you do the work necessary to see if you can prevent it. But at some point, you have to cut your losses. And I think that's healthy. And just even acknowledging stuff is hard, right? When's the last time you've seen a VC acknowledge that a fund of theirs didn't work out? Or actually, one of the things I was interested in posting, and not to pick on particular companies, But there are some companies, take Bird, for example, that at one point got some funds their next fund, right? Because it was
Mhm.
where it was marked and perceived to be a fund returning companies, and now they're bankrupt.
Bird is the scooter company, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, and
And
now,
they're either currently bankrupt or on the verge of bankruptcy or whatever, right? And what do we think about a VC's track record of investing in a company that gets really hyped? Everybody says you're successful, and maybe they even exit. Actually, maybe there's some folks made money at the time, and now the company is sort of on the border of not existing. How do we talk about that? Is that a successful VC investment just because you got your money out before everybody else caught the falling knife? It's pretty nuanced, and I think a lot of sort of social media has a hard time with nuance too, right? To say, hey, I'll acknowledge that if I was invested in a fund that invested in Bird, they probably got out at a return I was very happy with. And so, in that sense, like maybe they're successful VCs. But in the we back great companies and we are great at company building, like that's kind of a fail,
right.
right? So those two things can be true at the same time, where you can make some money on stuff that ultimately doesn't really work out and doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily become a sustainable company. But that's hard to weave into somebody's bio or to talk about. And the other thing is, who's going to talk about that, right? Because are you going to pick on a particular VC fund for that when like you actually do kind of need a Series A and they're in your pipeline, and you don't really get upside from negging the VC fund that you want to check from? It's a complex ecosystem, and ultimately people need funding, so they're not going to pick on the VCs too much.
I think a few things you said really kind of lights off for like lots of ideas coming in. Once I figured out some of this nuance when I was starting my career in Silicon Valley, and I realized there were people being lauded for exits, and it was really just an acqui-hire, and no one made money, and the investors just got their money back. I kind of like the Philly girl in me was like, well, this is some BS. I don't want to be like, I don't want to be in a community that like builds people up like this and doesn't admit what like the actual reality is. But if we're talking reality, I mean, when it comes to most like angel investors or venture funds, isn't like the simple math you're meant to look at is like you may invest in 10 companies and you believe all of them can 10 to 100x your returns. The fact of the matter is you should assume 5 of them are going to flat out fail and you're going to lose your money. 2 to 3 might break even. 2 to 3 might have some returns that end up covering the losses, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
for sure.
simple math of it is that
We're wrong most of the time.
yeah. Yeah, or
You
at
can say
least
it.
half of the time you're for sure wrong. Um, okay. So, and yeah, I had some other things, but I think I'll keep going. So part of it makes sense raison d'etre is that I really believe that to be the innovators that can solve the world's greatest problems, we need to bring more right brain thinking into our process. Approach problem solving with a little more humility, which is hard for entrepreneurs because you have to be audacious enough to set out on your own and believe you can build this great company, but also have the humility to say, I don't know what I don't learn. And I think that is a really balance beam that is hard for a lot of founders to walk. Um, Asking
Guys,
more, what? What do
guys,
you,
that's
guys?
hard.
Okay,
I
you're
don't
saying,
I don't really think that there's a pervasive problem among female entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs of color for having not enough humility. I think the opposite is probably true.
mm-hmm. Yeah. I ran Labs, this program, pre-accelerator, had over 100 startups go through it over 6 years. And I never outright said that the program was designed for women, and I never marketed it as like women only, but I understood that women were more likely to want to follow a process that is laid out for them rather than cavalierly just start throwing things at the wall and run as fast as they can to get something into the market.
I would
Uh,
guess that your participants were 85% female.
Something like that. Yeah, something like that. Mostly, like a lot of them are also non-technical. So this popular speak calling back to what you said about, you know, we act like it's a very prescriptive way to build a startup. The prescriptive way, everything built off of like, Eric Ries lean startup, 13 years ago or whatever, is like that assumes you have technical talent on the founding team that can spin up websites and prototype things really, really fast. And for any non-technical founder that's going solo until they find a partner or hire out, they don't have that ability to, build things, break them, fail fast with code. They have to be able to do it they have to be able to experiment a different way, which is why I designed the program that I did. Um, so you reshared a post recently on why slowing down is imperative for creative thinking. Um, but I kind of think back to, the early 2000s where, first to market was the overriding, pressure. So how do I think it's getting better over the past 24 years or so, but how do we make it okay to slow down just a little bit more?
That's a really good question. I think to some extent, I don't know if slowing down is always the answer. I think it is a lot of times the answer before you make a lot of investments in time and resources,
Mhm.
right? And so when you feel like you have something, yes, there's a value to going fast. But when you are in a design phase, when you are trying to find product market fit, careful analysis of feedback, um, and I think overall, actually, sort of stumbled upon the answer here. I think process is really important. Uh, One of the times, it's funny because I just came out of a conversation internally where this is sort of the case, where if you don't spend enough time figuring out the process around decision making, if you don't come to agreement about priorities, they'll just or you don't stage stuff out and plan like, well, we are aiming to get, this milestone by this date or whatever. Then you essentially have no rate limiter, right? You have nothing telling you whether you're going fast enough, and therefore it's never fast enough, right? If you say, "Hey, I'm starting a company," or I'm everything is happening slower than you think, versus if you just plan out and you say, "Well, I'm starting a company, and realistically, I'm trying to have 100 conversations with potential customers. Given my current schedule, that I'm working on something full time, I could really probably at max almost make three uh, calls a week, and so this is just going to take me 30 weeks to do." Okay,
Mhm.
great. You've budgeted in the right amount of time for the process that you said in the beginning is just going to be required. And so I think having good process around something is a way to give things their due time. Um, and also having somebody to work with, frankly, like a lot of solo entrepreneurs feel a lot of time pressure, and sometimes just talking stuff out with somebody, just to have somebody be like, wait, you did X, Y, and Z in just 2 months so far. You've accomplished like, hey, awesome job. That's
Mhm.
amazing that you've gotten this far. And just having that mirrored back to you to be like, right,
It's extremely
okay, like
valuable.
this is okay. Like I'm going at an okay pace. I think is really helpful to people, and it makes pacing okay because it is definitely a marathon, and And by the way, when you have limited resources, when you're funding something on your own, when you're doing your own projects and time and attention, it's costly, right? And
Hmm.
it's hard to recover from mistakes. You'd rather spend, 3x the time on planning and learning than put something out that like isn't the right thing and realize you've blown 90% of your budget on the build of an app or what have you, only to realize that it's actually completely wrong what the market needs, to then find out what the market needs and not have the resources to put it out there because you overbill.
Happens to so many. Happens to
Hmm.
so many people. I like the kind of reminder, especially when you're about to make big investment in time and resources, like pivoting, right? One of the top reasons startups fail is a pivot gone bad. And it's, a lot of times it's like they hear one potential customer say, we'd rather it this way. And then they switch, they go too fast rather than doing their due diligence. So I appreciate that. One of the other questions I kind of had in this is that you're a huge proponent of the New York ecosystem. I kind of gave a very short missive on one of the things I did not like about being in the West Coast. So, what do you think, having been in the innovation community for so long, what do you think NYC's culture has contributed over the years to the kind of mostly Silicon Valley driven approach to startups?
I think there's a certain amount of openness in the New York City community that I really have come to appreciate as a real differentiating factor versus the Valley. When you go into a place like the Valley that is a one industry town where you have multiple generations of startup success, you're going to walk into a room where other people have pedigree, right? They built this for, whatever company in the 80s and whatever company in the 90s and whatever company in the 2000s. And look, like, pedigree is a proxy and the world is complex and we use proxies for stuff, right?
Hmm.
VCs, I used to get 2,000 pitches in a year and invest in 10 of them, right? So it's hard not to go through that process without shortcutting sometimes.
Hmm.
And when you have a world where people have this sort of on paper pedigree and you are trying to create proxies for quality or potential or whatever, they're undoubtedly going to use that stuff. New York, good startups kind of fall out of the sky. I mean, it's funny. I was just having an exchange with Bill Magnuson, the co-founder of Braze, formerly Appboy, and I realized that he and his teammates who started the company won the TechCrunch Disrupt hackathon in 2011. And
Hmm.
I judged it. I did not realize that I had met him before. He's the CEO of a $5 billion public company. He did the dream, right? He founded it from scratch and raised a seed round and IPO'd and all of this sort of stuff and has continued to be a very successful company. That was anybody's deal to back at the time, right? He
Hmm.
just won a hackathon. Like,
Yeah.
anybody could have joined that hackathon. Like, and so, there wasn't this sort of walled garden of access here in New York. And I don't even know what he was doing before, but he certainly wasn't the person who built X, Y, or Z for Facebook or Google or Amazon or what have you, right? It was just a developer like any other countless developers who've ever participated in a hackathon. And
Hmm.
I like that aspect of the New York ecosystem that you can go to a meetup or an event or what have you, and there isn't just this assumption that like, oh, that's a B tier thing, and this is an A tier thing, and Sequoia is supporting this but not that, or what have you. I think there's a lot of open opportunity. Obviously, every interaction, professional interaction, people come with their own biases and all of that sort of stuff. But just in general, comparing the two ecosystems, there's definitely an openness and a much better access to folks in here.
Having been spent part of my career in both ecosystems, one of the things that I thought you were going to say, and maybe you were but you just didn't lean into it. But when I lived in San Francisco, it was like the tech community that worked 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. There's the finance community that worked 4 a.m. to 2 p.m., something like that. And then there were like tons of nonprofits and other, in the Presidio and outside firms like Levi's and Gap. Um, and there wasn't a lot of socialization
Overlap.
between those three major communities. Whereas in New York, because I remember as it was growing more, um, the it was the media, digital media, fintech, all of these, not just technology for technology's sake, but technology to support these different industries. So I
A
and
lot
I
of the people in New York who are in tech don't consider themselves to be in tech
Mhm.
necessarily, or even part of the tech community. I
Yeah.
can't tell you, I run this newsletter for over 18,000 people, which seems like a lot, but I run into lots of people just in our social networks and parties and whatever. It's like, oh, you're at a venture firm? Yeah, never heard of that firm. Oh, you have a newsletter? Yeah, never heard of it. Where do you work? Oh, you work at a startup. You're a developer at a startup. And, I've invested in 100 startup companies and we've never run into each other. Um,
Mhm.
that's the kind of thing that happens here. Whereas I feel like in the, tech community in a one industry town, in fact, that's the nature of all one industry places, right? I'm sure everybody in LA knows everybody else in the, in Hollywood kind of
Right.
thing, right? You know who's who, and it's important to be like, on the lists and whatever. Whereas here, it's funny. A founder once told me that this is a founder who exited their company for, I don't know, like $500 million or whatever. And he met a hedge fund person who probably like made that in the last year, and he thought he
Right.
was like hot shit in tech. And there's always, somebody down the road who's doing something bigger or what have you. And so we're all kind of keep our heads down a little bit and just do our work and
Mhm.
don't pay that much attention to, you know, industry standing type stuff.
Mhm. Okay, so because I really want this, 5 minutes on this last segment, I'm gonna tie that up quite abruptly and move here. So our third segment is, what do you know? And I know over email I said maybe we'd go through a bunch of hot mess things, but I picked one that I really specifically would like your opinion on. So what do you know? This is where us relatively intelligent tech ecosystem insiders discuss a hot mess that's made national news. And we might be experts, but we probably just know more than you. So you wrote a blog last June called This is Going to Be dot 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 not on Substack, explaining why it was a letdown and why you were moving back to your own site. Now, since the fall until now, headline Substack says it will not remove or demonetize Nazi content. I don't know that those two were connected for you, but why don't you first tell us what were the big factors for you to say, I'm going to go back to my own site and not Substack?
So I didn't necessarily know about Substack's Nazi problem when I
Mhm.
moved over,
If it
but
had hit like the big news, the expose in the Atlantic was end of November. So,
right, right. So for me, and it's interesting because I teach a course called Visible Work about thought leadership and solving the blank page problem for professionals and getting yourself out there. And one of the things we talk about is separating yourself from your audience, and how the reality is, like, if you are dependent on platforms for a connection to your audience, there's going to be an algorithm in between you and them, right? And if you are not paying to send an email directly to a person, then some advertiser is paying to get in between you and their audience, and there's a platform that is optimizing to their best financial interest. And sometimes that means showing your content, sometimes not. And so over the years, depending on what platform you started out, I mean, look, Medium has had the same issue where,
Mhm.
a bunch of people started posting to Medium, and then Medium decided they were going to put up some paywalls, and you only had a certain amount of free articles. And it was very frustrating for people who tried to build up an audience there who didn't necessarily want to directly monetize them. And so Substack started putting up some really odd fake paywalls of like, well, Charlie's not charging now, but if he did, how much might you pay him? And it was just cutting down my subscription rates because they were like, oh, well, Charlie's thinking about paying. Maybe I'm not going to bother because I don't want to
Mhm.
pay to hear his random ramblings. And so I just went back to like, look, I have an audience, I have an email list. I want to own that list. I want to be able to send them things directly whenever I want. And part of it was also my frustration over Twitter too, right? Where I spent 16 years, built up to 45,000 followers, and then the platform changed. And I had a good time there for a while, but in hindsight, I'm like, oh man, what a bunch of wasted effort. And so I just wanted to bring sort of everything in that control back in house, and I wound up moving over to Squarespace, where I can, control the brand, control the messaging, control the access, and leave the discovery to other platforms, right? So the home for all of my stuff is in this, is that this is going to be big, but I still use the other platforms for promotion and trying to drive new eyeballs and tagging and all of that sort of stuff. But yeah, it just goes back to that saying, right? If you're using something for free, you're the product.
Right.
And I think, if you're the product, you don't necessarily have control. And I wanted a little bit more
Mhm.
control over my audience.
So I will give you the TLDR on the Nazi gate, which is Nazis are bad. Nazis are on Substack. Substack should deplatform them or demonetize them. And they are not, because they have to tread the line of what is free speech and what is not. And but they have they're probably only like 16 plus publications, but some of them are by people that have been deplatformed by Medium and Twitter because of what they write about. For me, I've been working towards creating a plan to funnel all of my content through Substack because I'd like to share more vulnerable stories and creative writing in a premium private space. One side of me thinks don't compromise your morals or values for money. Take the time to build out your own stack. The other side thinks I'm only hurting myself and making it harder on me to do all the work. So I'm wondering if you have any advice.
Yeah, I do. In some way, to me, I think Substack made it easy because they didn't actually generate any incremental new users for me, right? And so, look, like we all want to stand on um, our values as much as possible, but we also have economic limitations. And if you're in a position where you feel that like you have a better ability to monetize in one place for another, or generate, I mean, let's just say, for example, that Substack was a place where as soon as you started publishing, you would 10x the number of consulting or class clients or what have
Mhm.
you. It'd be a hard choice, right? It'd be a much harder choice. But in my experience, like I just actually wasn't even getting that. So
Mhm.
it's going to be one thing if you're a platform that like we stand on free speech and there's going to be some stuff here you're not going to agree with, but it's still a great platform. It's like, well, it actually wasn't even a great platform. So then
Mm.
like what am I doing here if it's not even crossing off my like low hanging fruit basic needs as somebody who is trying to be a user. The one thing he said that I'll sort of disagree with is a lot of the reason why some of these folks are not doing this is because despite Silicon Valley's promise of we can solve all hard problems with tech and all that sort of stuff, this is they just haven't proven good at solving this at scale. because it's actually kind of a human problem, right? There just needs to be somebody there who stands on something that isn't wide open techno libertarianism, which to me is like a little bit lazy.
Hmm.
I think, like, yeah, sure, there are some people who are, hardcore, government should not interfere and anything and all of that sort of stuff. But I think most reasonable people agree that shouldn't shout fire in a crowded theater, and that there are some limits um, to to free speech. And I think they're just kind of being a little bit lazy about it, and also there's kind of an echo chamber there, right,
Hmm.
where among certain circles you get applauded and patted on the back for espousing certain views, and many of those people are check writers, right,
Right.
and so they're just catering to their own economic constituency for
Hmm.
the most part. So I don't necessarily think it's a free speech moral high ground, to be honest. I think that's not quite what it is.
Cool. Well, I appreciate your opinion. I definitely am going to re-listen to this and consider what I'm doing over the next few months and what my plan is. So let's make it make sense. I think the biggest kind of takeaway is that to solve the world's greatest problems, sure, slowing down at the beginning is great. Slowing down between it's also really important. But there is a time to move fast, particularly when things are working. So I appreciate having you, Charlie, and thank you all for listening to Make Sense. I know people can find you at next.nyc, and this is going to be big.com and LinkedIn. Anywhere else you want anyone to find you, or is that it?
Most
It
people.
feels like more than enough. If you can't find me after that, then all right. As always, you can check out all the links and resources in the show notes. Final note, if you want to continue to be the smartest person in the room, make sure you're getting notified when each episode hits. On YouTube, hit the subscribe button for next week's episode. And for audio only, follow wherever you get your podcast. Thank you, Charlie, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I think I might have cut you off too soon. I know you have a